and welcome to the Early American Culture. Back in November, we started to discuss a cultural story, sort of how America sort of come to be and do some of the traditions and things that we celebrate. So to do that, and to understand that, we first think about the first people that lived here. So that was part one of our story. Part one of our story started with the Native Americans. They were the first people that lived in North America. But the question is, did they always live in North America? No, they didn't. And so the next question would be, where did they come from? You're right, they came from Asia. And then the next question would be, well, how did their ancestors get from Asia to North America? And so if you remember and did some of the lessons or clicked on some of the videos on my website pertaining to the Native American culture, we learned that the Native American Indians were tracking food, looking for a better way of life, and trying to get out of some of the cold and miserable climate of the Ice Age, and they walked from Asia across the land bridge that connected Asia and North America into what we call United States of America. And as this journey, which took hundreds of years to happen, the climate started warming up. They started farming. They started splitting up and going in different directions. And mainly, one of the big things that I'd like for you to know and remember from the Native Americans is that they used the materials and the resources they had in their area. So that's why they all didn't live in teepees and they all didn't make the same kind of stuff. It really depended on the resources they had in the region that they lived. And so over the years, we usually try to do different art projects in different grades pertaining to the different regions. So I know first grade has done hide paintings in the past. We have, which are based on the buffalo that lives in the plains. Second grade usually does pictographs. We use charcoal and pastels and paper and try to make it look like rocks or drawings that were created on rocks from the Midwest. Kindergarten creates kachina dolls, which is something you can find in the Southwest. Third grade usually does pottery bowls, which is also from the Southwest. And if we ever get a chance, sometimes we even try to squeeze in totem poles, which are made in the Northwest coast. Now, for part two of our cultural story, the Native Americans have already spread all over North America and are doing their own thing, but let's focus in on Europe. Europe, as Native Americans are doing their thing in parts of Europe, we have great cities that have been greatly developed. And so we talk about this famous explorer named Christopher Columbus, who in his day, he was trying to help people in Italy and Spain and parts of Europe. He was trying to help them to go all the way around Africa and trade with India and China and bring all of those supplies back. And that took a long, long trip. And so all the explorers who were going this way, Christopher Columbus decided to do something different. What if Christopher Columbus decided to head west, go this direction, and he can end up in China a lot quicker than it would be if he went all the way around Africa? What he didn't know was this big, huge chunk of land on this side that we call North and South America. So when Christopher Columbus set on his great exploration, he actually bumped into and landed on some of the tiny islands just south of Florida. And he called this place America. And so he then came back, sailed back home to Spain and told everybody here in Spain and in Europe about this great place over here. And that set forth all of the other explorers from other countries and parts of Europe coming and exploring and meeting some of the Native American Indians that lived here. So what we're doing is we're fast forwarding through time a little bit and zooming in on Europe, and we're going to focus our part two of our story focuses in on England. At this time, King James ruled England, and he made many rules. Some of the people did not like some of the rules, and so they asked King James if they could leave. Could they go and live somewhere else? And where were they going to go? Well, a lot of them decided to go and live in America. And some of the main reasons of why they wanted to leave was, number one, to create a better life for themselves. Number two, to explore new lands and see what kind of natural resources they can find. Maybe they can find gold and other riches. And one of the main reasons is to have religious freedom. So here comes part two of our story, really deals with the people who left England and decided to live in America, but they had to ask the king's permission. So we call them Pilgrims. The Pilgrims who landed, the first settlement that was established by the Pilgrims is a place called Roanoke. Roanoke is actually in the little part of what we now call North Carolina. And they set up a fort right here where it's the ocean is sort of blocked by this little landmass, but it wasn't a really good place for them to farm, and they really struggled. Long story short, they call this colony the Lost Colony. So if you want to check out some books in the library, you can always ask Miss Keeling to see maybe learn about some of the Pilgrims and some of the first settlements, and you can find out why they call it the Lost Colony. The second group of Pilgrims, King James wanted to send them. King James sent a group and by the leader of John Smith, who led this group. They came and set up in Virginia. So it's a little bit north of North Carolina. King James, not King James, but John Smith, Captain John Smith, had a lot of conflict with some of the Native Americans that lived in this area. Pocahontas is a young daughter of one of the chiefs, and due to Pocahontas, helped settle some of the disputes between the Pilgrims and the Native Americans in this area. So if you'd like to read more about and learn more about the Pocahontas story, it happens in Jamestown. You can go down to our library and ask Miss Keeling if she has any kind of books on Pocahontas. Our third group of Pilgrims that landed is the one that we usually think of around in November in thinking about the Thanksgiving traditions. These are the Pilgrims who landed on Plymouth Rock. Now, I want you guys just to think for a second of what it would have been like if you were a little boy or a little girl that lived in the early American time period, and you were one of these pilgrims on this very crowded ship called the Mayflower. The Mayflower was a very small ship. It was very crowded, had 102 people on it of all ages, and they were tossed on this ocean for about 65 days. Many of the people that were on this voyage had never ever stepped foot on a ship, and so this was their first experience of being out on the open ocean, which it had to have been a very horrible boat ride. Once they arrived in the New World, America, they realized that there was nothing here. Because they landed so far north due to the storms, there was no other people that lived here. They had no houses, no stores, no food, and there was no one there to help them. That winter was extremely rough, and about half of the Pilgrims that made the voyage didn't make it through that winter. And out of the 52 people that survived, 20 of those were actually children. So luckily, they did make it through the winter, and luckily that in the springtime, the Pilgrims met some of the friendly Native Americans who actually helped them. That would be Squanto and the Wampanoag tribe. Now, the Native Americans taught the Pilgrims how to plant food. They taught them how to live off land. They really helped them in their time of need when they were desperately needing an extra hand. But I want you guys to realize to survive, the Pilgrims had to make many things by hand. They had to use their knowledge and skills that they had learned from England to make such items like their clothing. When we were in class in a normal school year, I always like to ask the kids, I said, who helped the Pilgrims make their clothes? And a lot of students will answer Native American Indians. I said, well, the Native American Indians would have used animal skins and hides to make their clothes. Pilgrims did something similar, but they make their clothes in a completely different way, and they learned this skill uh, from England. So they brought this knowledge and skills with them when they came. So they would have used the hair that grew on sheep called wool. They'd give the sheep haircuts, that's called shearing, and they'd use all of that wool that they get from the sheep, and they'd spin it on a spinning wheel to make thread, sort of like yarn. Then they would take the thread and yarn and take it to a loom. Now, a loom is how the Pilgrims would use, and they would take the thread and weave it over and under some of the threads that's tied to the loom. And that's how they would weave to make sheets of fabric, and they'd take and cut shapes out of the fabric to make their clothes. They also had to build their houses by hand. And so what I find really interesting is the Pilgrims and the Native Americans both are using the trees, the materials in this area, but they build their homes completely different. And so what I'm trying to get is the Pilgrims brought this skill of how they build houses. They brought this skill and knowledge with them when they left England and parts of Europe. They would have used axe and saws to cut down trees. They would use special kinds of axes and tools to take the trees and split it in making boards, and use dried reeds and plants for making their roofs. And on the inside, they would use clay and mud to fill in all the gaps and spaces so the wind's not and the rain's not coming in on them. Speaking of using nails to build your home, blacksmiths are people that live in the village in the colonies that would they have the skill and knowledge of how to dig up metal from the earth, how to melt it in a furnace and a fire, and how to hammer it and form it into shapes that they need, like making things like nails, tools, door hinges, and horseshoes. When it got dark, they didn't have light switches to flip on, and they didn't have electricity to run lights and light bulbs, so they made candles. In making a candle, you tie some strings to a stick, that's called the wick, and then you sort of dip these strings into the melted wax, and you let that harden, and then you dip it again, and let that harden, and you dip it again, and you repeat this process until the thickness of the candle is as thick as you want it. So every time you dip it and let it harden, it adds an extra layer of wax, which makes the candle a little thicker. They would have used beeswax. They would use other plant and other animals' materials to make the kind of wax used in making candles. They also made quilts and blankets. You had to keep yourself warm in the really cold winters, so a nice thick quilt hopefully would do the job. But they also used these quilts and stitching techniques to teach the children. Because back in the beginning of the Pilgrims, when they first started coming over, it was very important for them to build homes and houses and find food. And they just didn't have schools at the beginning. And so later on, they started teaching their children how to read and write by stitching. So if the young child can create and stitch the ABC letters, the numbers, and maybe even give a quote from a Bible or from a book, then the sampler quilts will show the knowledge of the kids as the things that they've learned as they're growing up. So in a way, the sampler quilts is an example of everything they know. So it's like a diploma that you get once you graduate high school. They also use quilting techniques for storytelling. So if you would stitch and use fabric and thread and stitch and create these images. There we go. We call that a block. And then you take the block, which tells one part of the story, you put all of the blocks together to tell the whole story. So we call that a storytelling quilt. And they also would use any kind of fabric they can find and cut them into geometric shapes and make what we call these geometric quilt blocks. And then they would sew those together. They may not, in a way they do tell a story, but they're more about the patterns, the designs, And so we call this a patchwork quilt because, again, they're just using any kind of materials and fabrics that they have. But they would cut them up into geometric shapes like triangles and squares and rectangles and piece them together to make these interesting designs. If you click on the other link, it will actually take you to an art activity dealing with the early American culture. So I hope you enjoyed the story and hope you enjoyed the project to come.